The mist in Cades Cove does not merely settle, it breathes. In the year 1880, the Great Smoky Mountains stood as an impenetrable fortress of ancient timber and jagged stone, cradling a community where life was measured by the rhythm of the seasons and the strength of one's word. It was a place of staggering beauty and crushing isolation, where the soil was hard and the faith of the people was harder. In this secluded valley, where the wind carried the scent of damp pine and wood smoke, lived a young woman named Elias. She was a creature of the mountains, possessed of a quiet strength and eyes that seemed to hold the shifting colors of the forest floor. Her heart, once as open as the meadows in spring, belonged entirely to a man named Isaac. Isaac was a carpenter by trade, a man whose hands knew the honest language of cedar and oak. He was gentle with a smile that could thaw the deepest winter frost, yet beneath his hard-working exterior lay a hidden tremor of restlessness. He wanted more than the meager life the cove usually offered, a desire that simmered quietly behind his bright eyes. Together, they were building a future. On a small plot of land near the edge of the woods, Isaac spent his evenings raising the frame of a modest cabin. Every hammer blow was a promise, every planed board a testament to the life they intended to share. Elias would often sit nearby, weaving baskets or preparing simple meals, her presence a silent anchor for his drifting ambitions. They were the envy of many, a picture of pure Appalachian devotion. However, shadows always linger where the light is brightest. Samuel, Isaac's cousin, watched the couple from the periphery of their happiness. Samuel was a man of substance and influence, owning vast tracts of fertile land that stretched across the valley floor, yet his wealth could not buy the one thing he craved most. He had long harbored a dark, suffocating obsession with Elias. To Samuel, she was the crown jewel of the cove, a prize that should have been his by right of his status. His resentment for Isaac grew like a canker, fueled by the sight of his cousin's simple joy. He viewed Isaac not as family, but as a thief who had stolen the woman Samuel believed was destined for a life of luxury by his side. The tension between the cousins often manifested in hushed, bitter arguments over inheritance and boundary lines. Samuel would frequently remind Isaac of the fragility of his position, in pointing out that a carpenter's wages would never provide Elias with the security she deserved. He planted seeds of doubt, whispering that Isaac's ambition was far greater than his reach. Isaac, though initially resistant, began to listen. The lure of prosperity, coupled with Samuel's manipulative reminders of his own limitations, started to weigh heavily on his mind. The cabin, once a symbol of love, began to look like a monument to his own poverty in the face of Samuel's sprawling estate. Old Martha, the village elder who lived in a shack woven into the roots of an ancient hemlock, saw the change in the air. Known by some as a healer and whispered by others to be a witch, she understood the language of the mountains. She watched Isaac's narrowing gaze and Samuel's predatory patience. Martha knew that when the heart is divided, the soul becomes a playground for darker forces. She tried to warn Elias, speaking in riddles about the way the frost kills the strongest blooms first, but Elias's loyalty was a shield that no warning could pierce. She believed in Isaac's goodness as surely as she believed in the rising sun. The breaking point arrived on a humid afternoon when the air felt thick with impending thunder. Samuel approached Isaac with a proposal that was as cold as a mountain stream. He offered Isaac a vast sum of money and the deed to a prime piece of timberland, an inheritance that would make Isaac one of the wealthiest men in the cove overnight. The condition was singular and devastating. Isaac must sever all ties with Elias. Samuel argued that Ilara was a distraction, or a woman of simple means who would only hold Isaac back from the social and economic heights he was now destined to reach. He claimed it was for Isaac's own good and for the good of the community that needed strong, unencumbered leaders. Isaac wavered, the image of the half-finished cabin clashing with the vision of golden fields and a life of ease. He looked at his calloused hands and then at the fine silk of Samuel's vest. The poison of ambition, carefully dripped into his ear for months, finally took hold. He convinced himself that he was doing this for a future he had always dreamed of, a future that Ilara could never truly understand. He chose the land over the heart, the gold over the promise. When Isaac finally confronted Ilara, the world seemed to go silent. He did not look her in the eye as he spoke the words that shattered her world. His voice was flat, stripped of the warmth she had known for years. He told her the engagement was a mistake, a youthful folly that no longer suited his path. He used excuses about his career and his need for a different kind of life, layering his betrayal in the cold language of practicality. Ilara stood frozen, the breath stolen from her lungs. She looked for a flicker of the man she loved in his face, but she found only a stranger wearing Isaac's skin. The pain was not a sharp cut, but a deep, hollow ache that threatened to consume her. In the days that followed, Samuel was quick to move in. He appeared at Ilara's door with false sympathy, offering baskets of food and words of hollow comfort. He spoke ill of Isaac's character, and in claiming he had always known his cousin was a man of weak resolve. He sought to position himself as the stable, noble alternative, his eyes gleaming with a triumphant hunger as he watched Ilara's grief. But Ilara, though broken, was not blind. She felt a cold shiver every time Samuel approached, a sense of a predator closing in on its prey. The truth, however, has a way of rising through the cracks of even the most carefully constructed lies. While washing linens by the creek, Ilara overheard two of Samuel's farmhands discussing the great trade their master had made. They laughed about how cheaply Isaac had sold his soul and the woman who loved him. The realization hit Ilara with the force of a mountain slide. It wasn't just a change of heart, it was a transaction. She had been traded for timber and dirt. And the grief that had paralyzed her was instantly cauterized by a white-hot flame of fury. She confronted Isaac one last time at the sight of their unfinished cabin. When she threw the truth of the deal in his face, he didn't even have the grace to deny it. He stood amidst the skeletal remains of their dreams and admitted he had chosen the better future. He told her he was sorry, but that some prices were worth paying. At that moment, the Ilara he knew died, and something much older and more dangerous was born in her place. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply looked at him with eyes that had turned as cold as the winter stars. She whispered a vow that the mountains themselves seemed to echo. She promised that he and Samuel would learn that the price of betrayal was higher than any mountain peak. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. This story of Cades Cove is only just beginning. As the sun dipped below the ridges, casting long skeletal shadows across the valley, Ilara walked away from the cabin and toward the old, overgrown cemetery at the edge of the woods. Standing among the weathered headstones of those long forgotten, she felt a kinship with the dead. She knelt on the damp earth and called upon the spirits of the cove to bear witness. The betrayal was complete, but the story of her vengeance was only starting its first dark chapter. The silence of the Appalachian heights was never truly empty. It was a living, breathing thing filled with the weight of secrets and the slow, grinding movement of time. Ilara moved through the dense thickets of Cades Cove like a shadow, detached from its source, her footsteps leaving no trace upon the damp, emerald moss. The vibrant, hopeful girl who had once laughed at the rising sun was gone, replaced by a woman whose heart had been forged into a cold blade within the fires of betrayal. She no longer sought the comfort of the valley floor or the warmth of the village hearths. Instead, she climbed toward the highest ridges, places where the air was thin and the wind spoke in the jagged, ancient tongues of ice and stone. Her isolation was not a retreat, but a transformation, a shedding of her former self to make room for something far more resilient and dangerous. She spent her days studying the way the hemlocks grew twisted in the perpetual shade and how the nightshade thrived in the dark, forgotten corners of the forest. The villagers, once her kin, now watched her from the safety of their porches, their whispers following her, like the dry rustle of autumn leaves. They saw the way her eyes had changed, no longer reflecting the blue of the summer sky, but the grey, unforgiving granite of the mountain peaks. She became a figure of hushed legends, a silhouette against the rising moon, and the name the Mountain Woman began to circulate through the cabins of the cove, spoken with a mixture of pity and an instinctual, mounting dread. In the deepest hollow, where the sunlight barely managed to pierce the thick canopy of ancient oaks, Elara found the dwelling of old Martha. The elder woman was waiting on her porch, her face a topographical map of 1,000 Appalachian winters. Her eyes milky with cataracts, but seeing more than any sighted person in the valley. Martha did not offer the traditional hospitality of tea or honey. She offered the heavy truth of the earth. She warned Elara that the path of the wronged is a narrow one, bordered on both sides by a darkness that, once entered, can never be fully unmade. The mountains don't forget, and they certainly don't forgive, Martha would croak, her voice sounding like dry bark rubbing together in a storm. But Elara was past the point of seeking forgiveness. She hungered for a justice that the law of men could not provide. Under Martha's stern tutelage, she learned the forbidden language of the root and the berry. She learned which leaves could soothe a fever, and which, when dried and powdered, could induce a waking nightmare that felt more real than the world itself. She learned to listen to the rhythm of the cove, understanding that every action sent a vibration through the valley that could be felt by those who knew how to listen. Elara's hands, once meant for the gentle tasks of a carpenter's wife, became permanently stained with the juices of potent herbs and the dark, rich soil of the woods. She was no longer a victim of Isaac's ambition. She was becoming the architect of a slow and meticulous undoing. While Elara retreated into the spectral embrace of the ridges, Isaac attempted to build his monument to success upon the foundation of his treachery. With the gold Samuel had provided and the marriage to a wealthy woman from a neighboring valley, Isaac should have been the most contented man in Cades Cove. But the gold felt unnaturally heavy in his pockets, and the land he had traded his soul for seemed to resist his touch. His new wife was a woman of fine silk and a disposition as cold as a mountain spring, a jagged contrast to the warmth and life he had discarded. The grand house he constructed stood as a testament to his betrayal, and soon its walls began to feel like the bars of a cage. It started with small, inexplicable misfortunes, a strange blight that touched only his tobacco fields while the neighbors' crops flourished in abundance, a sudden, pervasive rot that claimed the finest oak timber in his carpentry shop, turning seasoned wood into mush overnight. The tools he had mastered over a lifetime began to turn against him, the blades dulling as if by magic or slipping to bite deep into his calloused flesh. At night, and the mountain mist would creep up to his windows, and in the swirling white forms he would see the outline of a woman standing at the edge of the trees. He would wake drenched in a cold sweat, the bitter taste of mountain laurel on his tongue, convinced that Elara was watching him from the shadows of the cemetery, her silent judgment more agonizing than any physical blow could ever be. Samuel watched Isaac's steady decline with a predatory satisfaction that he carefully masked as cousinly concern. He tightened his grip on Isaac's affairs, positioning himself as the only person who could save the man from his mounting debts and unfortunate luck. He whispered poison into Isaac's ear, claiming that the community was beginning to blame Isaac's woes on a curse brought about by his treatment of Elara. By fueling Isaac's paranoia, Samuel ensured that his cousin remained a broken man, entirely dependent on the person who had engineered his ruin. Flush with the success of his manipulation and convinced he had finally erased Elara from the equation of the cove, Samuel decided to consolidate his power by taking a bride of his own, a young girl from the village whose family was deeply indebted to him. The wedding was intended to be a display of opulence that would silence all dissent, a grand celebration of his dominance over the valley. But the air during the festivities was stagnant and oppressive, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. When the music was at its peak and the laughter was loudest, the crowd suddenly parted as if cut by an invisible scythe. Elara appeared at the edge of the clearing, her presence a sudden, icy draught in the warm evening. She did not scream and she did not cast accusations. She simply walked to the head table, her gaze fixed on Samuel, and placed a small, intricately carved wooden box before him. "A gift for the man who believes he owns the cove," she said, her voice a low, melodic chime that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of those listening. Inside the box lay nothing but a handful of black soil taken from the oldest, most neglected grave in the Cades Cove cemetery, mixed with the dried, shriveled petals of a flower that only bloomed in the deepest, most lightless parts of the hollow. From that day forward, the light seemed to drain out of Samuel's world with agonizing slowness. What began as a lingering, dry cough transformed into a wasting sickness that defied every remedy known to the local healers. He grew pale and gaunt, his once sharp mind clouded by vivid visions of skeletal figures dancing in the moonlight. He became obsessed with the idea that the soil Elara had given him was a tether, a physical weight dragging his soul toward the cold earth of the graveyard. Isaac, seeing his cousin wither and his own life reduced to a series of failures, could no longer bear the suffocating weight of his guilt. In a fit of desperate, sobbing remorse, he tracked Elara to a high, rocky clearing that overlooked the entire valley. He fell to his knees in the dirt, his voice breaking as he confessed the full, sordid extent of the deal he had made with Samuel. He begged for her mercy, not to restore his fortune, but to grant him a single night of dreamless sleep. Elara stood above him, silhouetted against a bruising, purple twilight sky that seemed to bleed over the ridges. She looked down at the man who had been her world and saw only a hollow shell, a creature utterly broken by the weight of his own choices. She did not offer the absolution he craved, nor did she strike him down. "You chose the gold and the dirt over the promise, Isaac," she whispered, her words carried away by a rising wind that smelled of coming rain. "Now you must live with the harvest you planted." She left him there, a man who had traded his future for a dream that had turned into a funeral shroud. As the nights grew longer and the shadows deepened over Cades Cove, Samuel lay in his bed, his breath rattling like dry leaves. In his final fevered moments, he reached out toward the window, his voice a mere thread of sound, as he whispered Elara's name, while from the distance, the old cemetery seemed to moan in a low, rhythmic lamento that echoed through the entire valley. The rattling of the wagon wheels against the frozen ruts of the road sounded like the chattering of teeth in the silence of the valley. It was a cold, unforgiving night in Cades Cove. the kind where the stars seemed to pull back into the blackness, leaving the world below to its own devices. Inside the wagon, Samuel lay amidst a pile of moth-eaten furs, his body a withered shadow of the man who had once commanded the respect and fear of the community. Every breath was a jagged struggle, a wet, rattling sound that competed with the rhythmic creak of the wood. Isaac sat at the front, his hands trembling as he gripped the reins, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He was no longer the proud man who had built a mansion on a foundation of lies. He was a man being driven by a singular, desperate purpose. Samuel had begged to be taken to the cemetery, convinced that the weight pressing down on his chest could only be lifted in the presence of the dead, or perhaps by the one person he believed held his soul in her calloused hands. The cemetery of Cades Cove was a place where the mountains seemed to lean in, the ancient oaks draping their heavy, leafless limbs over the tilted stones like guardians of a forgotten secret. As the wagon groaned to a halt near the gate, the mist began to curl around the wheels, thick and white as wool. Isaac climbed down, his legs feeling like lead, and helped his cousin from the back of the wagon. Samuel was nearly weightless now, a bundle of brittle bones and papery skin, but his eyes were wide and burning with a feverish intensity. He looked toward the center of the graveyard, toward the oldest plots where the stones were smoothed by time. And there she stood. Elias did not emerge from the shadows. She seemed to be a part of them, her dark cloak blending into the gloom, her face illuminated only by the faint silver glow of a waning moon. There was no magic in the air, no sparks of lightning or voices from the beyond, only the heavy, damp smell of the earth and the sound of the wind sighing through the pines. Samuel collapsed onto the cold ground, his fingers clawing at the dirt she had once given him in a box. He gasped her name, a plea for mercy that died in the cold air. Isaac stood back, paralyzed by a mixture of shame and awe, watching the woman he had once loved and then betrayed. Elias walked toward them with a slow, deliberate grace, in her boots making no sound on the frost. She didn't look like a witch or a spectre. She looked like the mountains themselves, ancient, enduring, and utterly indifferent to the petty greed of men. When she reached Samuel, she did not strike him, nor did she mutter any incantations. Instead, she knelt beside him, her presence casting a long shadow over his shivering form. Her voice when she spoke was not filled with the fire of vengeance, but with a terrifying, quiet clarity. She told him that the sickness devouring him was not born of a spell or a demon, but of the very thing he had used to gain his power. She revealed that the tinctures and tonics he had been consuming, the ones he had obtained through back-alley deals and whispered recommendations she had carefully planted across the valley, were never meant to heal. And they were a slow-acting poison, a mixture of mountain roots and minerals that mimicked the symptoms of a wasting plague. It was a poison that worked in tandem with his own paranoia, a medicine that fed on his guilt until his mind finished the work that the chemicals had started. Samuel's eyes rolled back as the realization hit him. The protection he had sought had been his undoing. The very fear that Elias had amaldiçoado him had driven him to consume the venom she had provided under the guise of a cure. His own obsession with her, his need to possess or destroy her, had been the leash by which she led him to this final, lonely plot of land. Elias watched him, her expression one of profound, weary justice. She told him that his life was ending not because of a curse, but because of his own nature. He had planted seeds of treachery, and he was now merely reaping the harvest. As the first light of a grey dawn began to bleed over the ridges, Samuel's breathing slowed and finally stopped. He died with his fingers tangled in the weeds of the cemetery, a man who had sought to own the cove and ended up owned by its soil. Isaac stood in the silence that followed, the weight of the moment pressing down on him until he sank to his knees. He looked at Elara, expecting her to turn her cold gaze on him next, to finish the ruin she had started. But Elara only looked at the body of the man who had been the architect of their shared misery. She looked at Isaac, and for the first time in years he saw a flicker of the girl she had once been, buried deep beneath the armor of the mountain woman. And the days that followed Samuel's death marked a profound shift in the rhythm of Cades Cove. Isaac did not return to his grand house or his failing business with a renewed spirit. Instead, he did something that the village had never seen. He began to dismantle the life he had built on Samuel's gold. He sold the lands he had acquired through deceit, returning the money to the families Samuel had squeezed for every penny. He walked away from the fine silks and the seasoned timber of his shop, choosing instead to live in a small, weathered cabin at the edge of the woods. He spent his days in manual labor, helping the elderly with their harvest and repairing the fences of those who could not pay him. He sought no recognition and offered no excuses. He simply worked, his hands becoming as scarred and stained as Elara's, and a silent penance for a promise he had broken long ago. Elara, too, underwent a transformation. The isolation she had sought during her years of vengeance began to soften. She did not return to the village as a social butterfly, but she no longer avoided the paths where people walked. She began to use the vast knowledge of herbs she had acquired, the same knowledge she had used to dismantle Samuel's life, to preserve others. She became a healer of a different sort, one who understood that the body and the mind were inextricably linked. People still whispered when she passed, but the whispers were no longer born of fear. They were born of a quiet, growing respect. She became the woman people sought when the winter fever took hold or when a child's cough wouldn't break. She lived in the space between the village and the wild, a bridge between the world of men and the ancient wisdom of the ridges. As the years stretched into decades, the story of the carpenter, the cousin, and the woman of the mountain began to settle into the marrow of Cades Cove. It became a legend, told around hearths on nights when the wind howled particularly loud. It was a tale of how a single act of betrayal could ripple through a valley for a lifetime, and how redemption was a path that had to be walked every single day, without end. Elara and Isaac lived their separate lives, but the valley felt their presence as a stabilizing force. The cemetery, once a place of dark omens and shadows, became a place of reflection. The trees grew taller, their roots twisting around the stones, and the grass eventually covered the spot where Samuel had breathed his last. In their twilight years, that when the hair of both was as white as the winter mist, they found themselves drawn back to that same cemetery. It was a soft, golden afternoon in late autumn. The air was still, and the smell of dried leaves was sweet. Isaac was sitting on a low stone wall, his back slightly bent by the weight of 80 years when Elara approached. They did not speak at first. There was no need for words after so much time. They simply sat together, watching the light fade over the peaks. The bitterness was gone, replaced by a quiet, resilient companionship that didn't need the fire of youth to sustain it. They were two old souls who had survived the storm they had created, finding a strange, peaceful love in the ruins of their past. They held hands, their skin like parchment, a silent testament to the fact that while the mountains remember everything, and they also have a way of softening even the sharpest edges of the heart. The echo of the wagon wheels eventually faded into the hollow, leaving a silence so absolute it felt heavy, like a shroud draped over the shoulders of the valley. Ilara stood at the edge of the dirt path, her hands pressed deep into the pockets of her wool coat, her fingers tracing the jagged edge of a small dried mountain laurel leaf. The cold was no longer just a season, it had become a permanent resident in the marrow of her bones. She watched the dust settle back into the frozen ruts of the road, realizing that with every inch of distance Isaac put between them, a part of her soul was being rewoven into something harder, something colder, and something far more enduring than the girl who had dreamed of a white lace wedding under the canopy of the Great Smoky Mountains. The betrayal did not burn like a sudden fire. It seeped into her life like a slow-moving rot in a cellar beam. For days, Ilara did not weep. The tears felt like a luxury she could no longer afford, a waste of moisture in a world that had turned to ice. Instead, she walked. She walked past the half-finished cabin Isaac had been building for them, the timber now greying and exposed to the elements, a skeleton of a life that would never breathe. She walked past the village store where Samuel would stand, his thumbs tucked into his waistcoat, watching her with a predatory patience that made her skin crawl. She realized then that Samuel's victory was not just in the land he had stolen or the man he had bought, as it was in the isolation he had crafted for her. He wanted her broken so that he could be the one to pick up the pieces and shape them into whatever image he desired. Seeking sanctuary from the prying eyes of the valley, Ilara climbed toward the higher ridges, where the air grew thin and the trees leaned away from the wind. There, nestled in a notch of the mountain where the sun rarely reached, sat the cabin of old Martha. The structure looked as though it had grown directly out of the earth, a tangled mess of logs and moss that smelled of wood smoke and ancient, drying things. Martha was waiting on the porch, wrapped in a quilt that seemed to contain every shade of autumn. She did not offer a greeting or a platitude. She simply held out a tin mug of elderberry tea, the steam rising in a thin, defiant line against the grey sky. For hours, the two women sat in a silence that was not empty, but filled with the shared understanding of those who have been cast out by the world of men. Martha spoke eventually, her voice like the grinding of stones in a riverbed. She told Ilara that the mountains did not recognize the laws of the village. The ridges did not care for contracts or dowries or the hollow promises of ambitious boys. She spoke of the roots that grew deep beneath the cemetery soil, roots that could heal or roots that could choke, depending on how they were tended. She showed Ilara how to identify the silver-leafed plants that thrived in the shadows and the bitter berries that could dull the sharpest pain or sharpen the dullest mind. It was here, under the tutelage of the mountain's shadow, that Ilara began her transformation. As she shed her softness like a snake sheds its skin, leaving it behind in the valley below. In the village of Cades Cove, the atmosphere began to shift. Isaac had moved into a larger, more imposing house on the eastern side of the valley, a property that Samuel had facilitated for him as part of their dark bargain. Isaac was now a man of substance, his pockets heavy with the gold Samuel had funneled through the land deals, and his arm draped with the fine wool of a new, wealthy bride chosen for her connections rather than her heart. Yet, to those who looked closely, the bloom had already begun to fade from his cheeks. He carried himself with a hunched urgency, as if he were constantly trying to outrun a storm that only he could hear. His eyes, once bright with the simple joy of his craft, were now restless and clouded with a flickering uncertainty. The first signs of the unraveling were subtle. A blight struck the corner of Isaac's newly acquired orchard, a black, oily fungus that withered the buds before they could even consider blooming. Then his finest team of horses, animals that had been the envy of the cove, grew skittish and refused to enter the barn at night, their eyes rolling back in terror at a scent that no human could detect. Isaac spent his nights pacing the floor of his grand house, the floorboards creaking under the weight of his guilt. He would look out the window toward the dark silhouette of the mountains and see, or perhaps only imagine, a single flickering light high up on the ridge, the hearth of old Martha's cabin, where Elias now resided. Samuel, however, was thriving. He moved through the village with an air of untouchable authority, his influence spreading like ivy over a stone wall. He took great pleasure in visiting Isaac, leaning against the hearth and regaling him with tales of their shared prosperity, all while subtly reminding Isaac of exactly what he owed him. Samuel's obsession with Elias had not diminished. It had merely evolved into a cold, clinical fascination. He heard the rumors of her being a mountain woman, a witch who spoke to the crows and gathered the nightshade, and he smiled. He believed that by driving her to the edge of madness and isolation, he had finally made her unique, a prize that only a man of his stature could eventually claim. He did not realize that the creature he was helping to create was no longer a prize, but a reckoning. Elias's visits to the cemetery became more frequent as the winter deepened. She did not go there to mourn the dead, but to listen to them. The haunted cemetery of Cades Cove was a place where the veil was thin, where the whispers of the ancestors mingled with the sighing of the pines. She would sit for hours among the headstones, her hands pressed against the cold marble, feeling the pulse of the earth. She realized that the people buried here were not gone. They were the foundation of the cove, and they were restless. They had seen the greed of men like Samuel before, and they knew how the story ended. She began to leave small offerings, bundles of dried herbs, smooth river stones, and locks of her own hair, binding her spirit to the land in a way that Isaac and Samuel, with all their deeds and titles, could never hope to achieve. But one evening, as a freezing rain began to turn the valley into a glittering cage of ice, Isaac found himself standing at the edge of the cemetery. He had been riding back from a business meeting in a neighboring town when his horse had suddenly reared, throwing him into the slush. As he picked himself up, his breath coming in ragged gasps, he saw her. Elias was standing near the grave of a child, her dark cloak blending into the shadows of the hemlocks. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her gaze caught his through the twilight. It wasn't a look of anger or even of sadness. It was a look of profound, terrifying recognition. It was the look of a mirror, reflecting a man's own rot back at him. Isaac tried to call out her name, to offer some explanation or some hollow apology, but the words froze in his throat. The wind picked up, a howling through the gaps in the stone walls, and for a moment the shadows seemed to lengthen and reach toward him like skeletal fingers. When he blinked, she was gone, leaving only the sound of the freezing rain clicking against the headstones. He scrambled back to his feet and fled toward the lights of his house, but the warmth he sought was no longer there. The fire in his hearth felt cold, the silk of his bed felt like a shroud, and the silence of his grand rooms was filled with the rhythmic, ghostly thudding of a hammer on a coffin, the sound of the life he had built, and the sound of the one he had destroyed. High above, in the cabin that smelled of wood smoke and secrets, Elias sat by the fire, her eyes reflected in the glowing embers. She held a small wooden doll in her lap, it a figure carved from a piece of scrap timber Isaac had discarded months ago. She didn't burn it, nor did she break it. She simply wrapped it in a piece of black thread, winding it tighter and tighter, until the shape of the man was lost beneath the darkness of the cord. The mountain outside groaned as the ice settled, a vast ancient lung exhaling into the night, and Elias smiled, a thin, sharp smile that never reached her eyes. The season of the promise was over, and the season of the debt had begun. The transition from winter to spring in Cades Cove was usually a time of rebirth, a period where the white shroud of snow retreated to reveal the vibrant green of the valley floor. But in the year following Isaac's betrayal, the spring felt stagnant, as if the land itself were reluctant to wake up. The air remained heavy with a damp, clinging chill that seeped into the bones of the villagers, and the usual chorus of songbirds was replaced by the low, mournful croak of ravens circling the high ridges. High above the valley, in the shadow of the ancient hemlocks, Elara had completed her transformation. She was no longer the girl who had once laughed by the creek or dreamed of a simple life in a hand-built cabin. Under the tutelage of old Martha, she had become a creature of the heights, a woman whose spirit was as jagged and uncompromising as the rock faces that guarded the cove. The villagers had taken to calling her the Mountain Woman, a title spoken in hushed tones behind closed doors. They saw her rarely, usually only as a distant silhouette against the sunset or a fleeting shadow moving through the dense underbrush. When she did descend into the lower meadows to gather the specific bitter herbs that old Martha prized, people gave her a wide berth. Her eyes, once warm and inviting, now held a piercing, crystalline quality that seemed to look through a person rather than at them. She moved with a silent grace that was unnerving, her footsteps leaving no sound upon the forest floor. Elara had learned the language of the mountains, the way the wind whispered through the gaps in the limestone, the way the roots reached out in the dark to find sustenance, and the way a single, well-placed word or gesture could ripple through a community like a stone thrown into a still pond. While Elara found a cold sort of strength in her isolation, Isaac found only a mounting sense of dread. The prosperity he had traded his soul for was beginning to taste like ash. His house was the largest in the eastern end of the cove, and his new wife, a woman of standing chosen by Samuel to solidify their social ranks, filled the rooms with fine linens and imported china. Yet Isaac felt like a stranger in his own home. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the rhythmic, ghostly thudding of a hammer, a sound that resonated in his chest like a second heartbeat. It was the sound of his own guilt, a persistent reminder of the life he had discarded. His carpentry shop, once a place of pride and creation, had become a source of frustration. The wood he worked with seemed to fight him. The grain would twist and knot in ways he had never seen, and his finest blades would dull after only a few strokes. The blight that had struck his orchard during the winter did not fade with the coming of the sun. Instead, it spread, turning the once promising blossoms into blackened, shriveled husks that smelled of rot. His livestock, too, seemed cursed. His cows produced bitter milk that would curdle before it reached the churn, and his horses remained skittish, their eyes rolling in terror whenever they were led past the edge of the cemetery. Isaac's nights were a gauntlet of terrors. He dreamt of the cemetery, the headstones rising up like teeth to swallow him whole, and Elara standing at the center of it all, her hands stained with the black thread she had used to bind his likeness. He would wake up drenched in a cold sweat, the scent of damp earth and mountain laurel thick in his nostrils, even when the windows were tightly shut. Samuel, ever the architect of Isaac's misery, saw the cracks forming in his cousin's resolve. Rather than offering comfort, Samuel used Isaac's growing instability to tighten his grip. He visited Isaac frequently, his presence a constant, suffocating weight. Samuel would sit by Isaac's hearth, sipping expensive whiskey and talking of new land acquisitions, all while casting sidelong glances at Isaac's shaking hands. He took a perverse pleasure in Isaac's decline, viewing it as a testament to his own superior strength. Samuel believed he had won, that by breaking Isaac and isolating Elara, he had proven himself the master of the cove. He dismissed the rumors of Elara's witchcraft with a booming, hollow laugh, calling it the superstitious nonsense of simple-minded folk. Yet even Samuel was not entirely immune to the atmosphere that had settled over the valley. He found himself avoiding the path that led past old Martha's cabin, and he noticed that the dogs in the village would snarl and tuck their tails when he walked by. Elara's revenge was not a sudden strike, but a slow, psychological siege. She understood that a man like Samuel, driven by pride and greed, was most vulnerable when his sense of control was threatened. She began to leave small symbolic tokens where Isaac and Samuel would be sure to find them. A bundle of dried nightshade tied with a lock of dark hair would appear on Isaac's workbench. A smooth river stone, etched with a jagged mark that looked like a broken promise, would be found in the pocket of Samuel's coat. These were not overt threats, but they acted as psychological anchors, dragging the men deeper into their own paranoia. The village, sensing the tension, began to weave Elara into their own folklore, and they whispered that she could command the mists of the cove to hide the sun, and that she had struck a deal with the spirits of the cemetery to ensure that no peace would ever return to those who had betrayed her. As the summer approached, Samuel announced his own marriage to a young woman from a prominent family in the village. It was to be a grand affair, a celebration of his wealth and influence that would eclipse even the finest weddings the Cove had ever seen. He spared no expense, importing silk from the coast and hiring musicians from the neighboring counties. He wanted the world to see him as a man at the pinnacle of his power, a man who had successfully conquered both the land and the people within it. Isaac, despite his deteriorating state, was expected to stand at Samuel's side as the guest of honor. Isaac dreaded the event, fearing that the public display of Samuel's triumph would finally shatter what little remained of his own sanity. The day of the wedding arrived with a heat that felt unnatural for the high country. The air was thick and stagnant, buzzing with the sound of cicadas that seemed to grow louder as the sun rose. The ceremony was held on the village grounds, under the shade of the ancient oaks, but the shade offered no relief from the oppressive atmosphere. Samuel stood at the altar, his chest puffed out with pride, but his skin looked unusually sallow in the harsh light, and a fine sheen of sweat covered his brow. He looked like a man who was holding his breath, waiting for a blow that he knew was coming, but could not see. Then, as the vows were being exchanged, a sudden, unnatural silence fell over the crowd. The cicadas stopped their buzzing, and even the wind seemed to die away. From the edge of the woods, a figure emerged, moving with a slow, deliberate pace that commanded everyone's attention. It was Elara. She was dressed in a gown of dark, forest green wool, her hair cascading down her back like a waterfall of shadow. She did not approach the altar, nor did she speak. She simply stood at the periphery of the gathering, her gaze fixed directly on Samuel. Her presence was like a sudden drop in temperature, a cold front that moved through the crowd and left a trail of goosebumps in its wake. She held a small, wrapped bundle in her hands, tied with the same black thread that had featured so prominently in Isaac's nightmares. She stepped forward and placed the bundle on the edge of the wedding table, near the tiered cake and the silver platters of food. It was a present for the groom, a symbolic offering that felt more like a sentence than a gift. As she turned to leave, her eyes met Isaac's for a fleeting second. In that moment, Isaac saw the full extent of the ghost he had created. He saw the girl he had loved, and he saw the woman who would now be his ruin. Elara vanished back into the trees as quickly as she had appeared, leaving the wedding party in a state of stunned, fearful silence. The celebration continued, but the joy had been sucked out of it, replaced by a lingering sense of doom that not even the strongest whiskey could wash away. Samuel's health, which had been robust only days before, began to falter that very night, marking the beginning of a decline that no doctor in the valley would be able to explain. The sickness that took hold of Samuel was not like any fever the people of Cades Cove had ever witnessed. It did not come with the usual hacking cough or the searing heat of a standard infection. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing theft of vitality. In the weeks following the ill-fated wedding, the man who had once strode through the valley as if he owned the very air began to shrink. His skin, once ruddy with the arrogance of wealth, turned the color of damp parchment, clinging tightly to the sharp angles of his cheekbones. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, became clouded with a milky film of terror, darting toward the corners of his darkened bedchamber as if he were watching an invisible clock count down his remaining hours. The grand house he had built as a monument to his ego became a mausoleum. The air inside heavy with the scent of stale sweat and the bitter medicinal tang of the various poultices the village doctors tried in vain. None of them could explain why his pulse thrashed like a trapped bird, or why his limbs grew so weak he could no longer lift a silver spoon to his lips. The village whispered that the mountain woman had finally claimed her due. They spoke in hushed tones at the general store and the forge, casting furtive glances toward the high ridges where Elias now lived. They remembered the bundle she had left on the wedding table, the way the black thread seemed to pulse under the flickering candlelight of the reception. To the people of the cove, the science of medicine was a distant, secondary thing compared to the ancient laws of the mountains. They knew a curse when they saw one, and they saw it in the way the crows gathered on the roof of Samuel's house, their black wings casting long, jagged shadows over the porch where he had once stood so proudly. Isaac, meanwhile, was a ghost of his former self. He spent his days wandering the perimeter of Samuel's estate, his eyes hollowed out by a guilt that no amount of prayer could soothe. He watched his cousin's decline with a mixture of horror and a sickening sense of inevitability. He knew that the rot starting in Samuel's body had its roots in the betrayal they had both orchestrated years ago, a debt that was now being collected with interest. Desperation finally drove Isaac to do the one thing he had feared most since the day he broke his promise. As the summer heat reached a suffocating peak, turning the valley into a cauldron of stagnant air, Isaac began the long, yet arduous climb toward the secluded cabin near the edge of the wilderness where Elias had made her home. The path was overgrown, the briars reaching out like skeletal fingers to snag at his clothes, but he did not falter. He bypassed old Martha's dwelling, fearing the old woman's knowing gaze, and pushed higher into the mist-choked hollows where the trees grew so thick the sun was a mere memory. When he finally reached the small, sturdy cabin that Elias had built with her own hands, he found her sitting on the porch, her hands busy with a bundle of dried herbs. She did not look up when he approached, but the air around her seemed to ripple with a cold, focused energy that made the hair on Isaac's neck stand on end. Isaac fell to his knees in the dirt, the strength leaving his legs as if the earth itself were draining him. And he began to speak, the words tumbling out in a jagged, frantic torrent. He confessed everything. He spoke of the night Samuel had come to him with the offer of land and gold, whispering of the life they could have if only Elias were out of the picture. He admitted to his own weakness, the way his ambition had blinded him to the value of the heart he was trampling. He told her how Samuel had manipulated him, using an old debt of Isaac's father as a lever to pry him away from her. But he did not blame Samuel alone. With tears streaming down his face, Isaac took the weight of the sin upon his own shoulders, begging for a mercy he knew he did not deserve. He told her how every piece of wood he had carved since that day felt like it was made of lead, and how the ghost of their shared future haunted every corner of his lonely life. He begged her to lift the shroud from Samuel, to let the man die in peace if he could not live in it, and to take whatever penance she required from Isaac instead. Alara remained, as silent and unmoving as the ancient rocks of the Smokies. She did not offer him a hand to rise, nor did she acknowledge his tears with so much as a flicker of pity. To her, Isaac was no longer the man she had loved. He was a lesson in the fragility of human promises. Her face was a mask of stoic resolve, her eyes reflecting the deep, dark green of the forest canopy. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and resonant, carrying the weight of the years she had spent in isolation. She told him that she was not a weaver of destinies, but a witness to them. She explained that the choices made in the darkness always find their way into the light. Ashram di Galdacul Afro, and that no man can outrun the shadow of his own heart. She did not confirm the rumors of witchcraft, nor did she deny them. She simply stood, gathered her herbs, and walked into her cabin, closing the door with a finality that echoed through the hollow like a gunshot. Isaac was left alone in the dirt, the silence of the mountain pressing in on him, heavier than any words she could have shouted. He realized then that her revenge was not a strike to be parried, but a mirror to be held up, and the reflection he saw was more terrifying than death itself. He returned to the village, a broken man, his spirit finally severed from the world of the living. He found Samuel's house shrouded in a silence so thick it felt physical. The doctors had left, their black bags tucked under their arms as they shook their heads in defeat. Inside the master bedroom, Samuel lay gasping for air, his body a mere skeleton draped in expensive silk. The torches around the room flickered wildly, though there was no draught to disturb them. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the valley into a bruised purple twilight, Samuel's breathing became a series of ragged, wet rattles. His eyes snapped open, fixed on the ceiling as if he could see through the roof to the stars beyond. He began to whisper a name, over and over, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering across a grave. "Ilara," he hissed, his fingers clawing at the air, trying to grasp at a forgiveness that was not coming. Outside, in the haunted cemetery of Cades Cove, a strange phenomenon began to occur. The wind, which had been still all day, began to rise, each swirling around the weathered headstones with a low, mournful howl. It was a sound of collective grief, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of the villagers' feet. Those who lived near the cemetery gates claimed they could hear the names of the dead being whispered back by the trees, a chorus of witnesses joining Samuel in his final, desperate plea. The iron gates of the graveyard creaked on their hinges, swinging open and shut, as if the earth itself were preparing to receive a guest it had been waiting for with grim patience. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and damp earth, a precursor to a storm that promised no relief, only a final, cold reckoning. In his bed, Samuel's eyes rolled back, his last breath rattling in his throat as the name of the woman he had tried to destroy hung in the stagnant air, a permanent stain on his legacy. The cemetery seemed to answer with a distant, hollow boom, like the closing of a great door, signaling that the first part of Ilara's justice had been served and the debt of the cove was far from paid. The village of Cades Cove felt the shift in its bones. People shuttered their windows and bolted their doors, even though the night was sweltering. They knew that the death of a man like Samuel, under such unnatural circumstances, would leave a mark on the land that time would be slow to erase. Isaac sat on the porch of his own neglected cabin, watching the flickering lights in the distance where his cousin's life was extinguishing. He felt a strange, cold peace, the kind that comes when the worst has finally happened and there is nothing left to fear. He thought of Elara in her mountain retreat, wondering if she felt the same vibration in the air, or if she was already looking toward the next chapter of the story they were all trapped in. The shadows of the Appalachian heights seemed to lean closer to the valley, whispering secrets to the mist as the legend of the mountain woman and the haunted grounds of the cove began to solidify into a history that would be told for generations. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It was a living entity, a participant in the unfolding drama of betrayal and the slow, inevitable crawl toward a redemption that still felt a lifetime away. The procession moved through the thick, clinging fog that always seemed to pool in the lower reaches of Cades Cove, a white shroud that swallowed the flickering orange light of the pine torches. Samuel's breathing was a frantic, wet sound, and the only thing breaking the oppressive silence of the night. 4 men carried his litter, their faces grim and etched with a fear they could not name, their boots squelching in the mud of the cemetery path. They reached the rusted iron gates of the graveyard, the very place where Elara had once stood and sworn her oath to the mountains. The ground here felt heavy, charged with an expectant energy, as if the earth itself were preparing to settle a long overdue account. Samuel's eyes were wide and bloodshot, darting toward every rustle in the undergrowth, his mind a fractured mirror reflecting 1,000 versions of Elara's face. He was convinced she had woven a web of dark magic around his heart, a spectral tether pulling him toward the cold soil. Just as the men reached the center of the clearing, Diasi, a figure stepped from the tree line like a spirit manifested from the mountain fog. It was Elara. She was no longer the girl with the shattered heart who had wept over a broken promise. She was the mountain woman, a figure of silent, terrifying authority. Her hair, once a vibrant chestnut, was now streaked with the silver of premature age and mountain frost. She did not carry a wand or a book of spells, but her presence alone seemed to turn the air brittle and cold. The villagers carrying the litter stumbled back, their torches dipping toward the earth as they made the sign of the cross or clutched their charms. Elara did not look at them. Her gaze was fixed solely on Samuel, who lay trembling on the furs, his fingers clawing at the air as if trying to grasp at a life that was rapidly receding. Samuel let out a choked, desperate sound, set his voice a dry rasp that barely carried over the moaning of the wind. He begged for the antidote, for the mercy of a counterspell to lift the weight from his chest and the fire from his veins. He confessed his sins in a panicked torrent, admitting to the manipulation of Isaac, the theft of the land, and the lies he had spun to isolate Elara from the community. He offered her everything he owned, the houses, the gold, the very ground they stood upon, if she would only let him live. Elara approached the litter slowly, her footsteps making no sound on the damp grass. She looked down at the man who had orchestrated her ruin, and for the first time in years a flicker of something other than cold determination passed through her eyes. It was pity, but a pity so sharp it felt like a blade. She leaned down, her voice a low, resonant whisper that seemed to come from the stones themselves. She told him that she was not a witch, and she had never placed a curse upon his blood. She revealed the truth that had been hidden in the shadows of his own paranoia. The tonic he had been taking for months, the bitter, dark liquid he had purchased from a travelling merchant Elara had quietly directed to his door, was nothing more than a mild purgative made of dandelion root and mountain water. It was harmless, meant only to cleanse the system. The sickness that was rotting him from the inside, the tremors that shook his limbs, and the visions that haunted his sleep were not the work of magic. They were the physical manifestation of his own guilt and the terror he had cultivated in his own mind. He had poisoned himself with the belief that he was doomed, and his body, fueled by a conscience he had tried to suppress, had simply followed the instructions of his own fear. Samuel stared at her, his jaw dropping as the realization hit him with the force of a mountain slide. The irony was a cruel, final blow. He had been destroyed not by her hand, but by his own capacity for cruelty, mirrored back at him until he could no longer bear the sight. The terror in his eyes did not fade, but it changed shape, transforming into a hollow, empty despair. As the moon broke through a rift in the clouds, casting a pale, sickly light over the cemetery, Samuel's heart gave out under the weight of his own shadow. He let out one final, rattling breath, his fingers relaxing their grip on his silken robes, and the silence that followed was so absolute it felt as though the entire valley had stopped breathing. The debt of Cades Cove had been paid, and the man who had sought to own the mountains was now nothing more than a guest in their cold, indifferent soil. In the aftermath of Samuel's death, a strange and quiet transformation began to take hold of Isaac. Standing over the grave of his cousin, he saw the wreckage of a life built on greed and felt the true weight of his own betrayal. He did not return to the hollow to count his inherited gold. Instead, Isaac walked straight to the land office and the village square. Over the next several months, he began to systematically dismantle the empire Samuel had built. He returned the stolen acreage to the families who had been cheated, and he used the remaining wealth to fund the construction of a new school and a community granary. He moved back into his old, modest cabin, picking up his carpentry tools once more. But this time, he did not build for profit. He built for the widows whose porches were sagging, for the orphans who needed sturdy beds, and for the elders who could no longer fetch their own wood. His hands grew thick with calluses and his back bowed under the labor, but the leaden weight that had sat in his chest for years began to lift, replaced by a weary, hard-earned peace. Ilara, too, found a new path through the thickets of her life. She realized that while her vengeance had been just, it had also been a prison. She sought out old Martha, who was now nearing the end of her long life, and sat at the old woman's feet to learn the true secrets of the Appalachian heights. She studied the ways in which the mountain could sustain and heal, rather than just how it could hide and haunt. She learned the language of the willow bark for fevers, the yarrow for wounds, and the ginseng for the spirit. Gradually, the villagers' fear of the mountain woman began to soften into a profound respect. They no longer crossed the street when they saw her. Instead, they brought their sick children to her porch, and she would meet them with a steady hand and a quiet word. She became the healer of the hollow, a woman who understood that the same earth that takes a life can also be the source of its renewal. Years turned into decades, and the 1880s faded into a new century. The legend of the haunted cemetery and the woman who commanded the mists became a story told to children to teach them the value of a promise. But for Ilara and Isaac, it was no story. It was the skin they wore. One autumn evening, as the maples were turning the color of spilled wine and the air held the first sharp bite of winter, the two of them found themselves at the iron gates of the Cades Cove cemetery once more. They were both grey now, their faces etched with the deep lines of lives lived hard and long. They did not speak of the betrayal or the poison or the years of silence. They simply stood together among the weathered headstones, watching the sun dip behind the purple peaks of the Smokies. Isaac reached out a trembling hand and took Ilara's, and for the first time since they were young and full of foolish dreams, she did not pull away. They were two survivors of a storm they had helped create, finding a quiet, mature love in the twilight of their years. As the shadows deepened, the cemetery felt not like a place of death, but like a place of rest. So its spirits finally silent, as the two old souls found their way back to the beginning. The turn of the century brought a subtle shift to the Appalachian peaks, a softening of the jagged edges of the 1880s that had once defined the survival of the settlers. In Cades Cove, the iron-hard winters still bit with the same ferocity, and the spring thaws still turned the valley floor into a sea of red clay mud, but the spirit of the place had begun to heal from the decades of tension. The harshness of the pioneer days was giving way to a more settled, reflective era where the legends of the past were becoming the foundations of the community's identity. Ilara watched these changes from her porch, her hair now a shocking mane of white that mirrored the winter frosts on the high ridges. She was no longer the girl who had screamed at the moon in a fit of betrayal, nor was she the icy spectre that had haunted the waking dreams of her enemies. She had become something far more enduring and vital, the living memory of the cove, a woman whose roots went as deep as the ancient oaks that guarded the cemetery. Her garden was a sanctuary of bitter and sweet, a living pharmacopoeia where she spent her mornings talking to the plants as if they were old friends who had survived the same storms she had. She knew which leaf would pull the heat from a child's brow and which root would steady a heart fluttering with the anxiety of the unknown. The villagers, who once whispered of her as a witch and crossed to the other side of the road, now brought her offerings of fresh eggs, salted pork, ice and jars of mountain honey in exchange for her wisdom. They saw in her a strength that had been forged in a furnace of suffering and tempered in the cool, restorative waters of forgiveness. Ilara accepted these gifts with a nod of quiet grace. Her eyes, once sharp with the needles of vengeance, now holding the vast, calm depth of a mountain lake at dusk. She had learned that the true power of the mountains lay not in their ability to hide secrets, but in their capacity to sustain life through the hardest seasons. Down the winding path that led toward the center of the valley, the rhythmic sound of a mallet hitting a chisel echoed from Isaac's workshop. He had grown into a man of few words, his life defined by the grain of the wood and the honesty of a straight line. Every piece of furniture he crafted carried a hidden signature of his redemption. The joints were tight, the surfaces sanded until they felt like silk, and the wood chosen for its resilience rather than its flashiness. He built the cradles that rocked the newest generation of Cades Cove, and he built the sturdy tables where families sat to break bread and share their own stories. He took no joy in the gold that had once tempted him toward betrayal, finding instead a profound satisfaction in the calluses on his palms and the knowledge that his labor served a purpose greater than his own comfort. He worked with the devotion of a man who knew he was building a bridge back to his own soul, one plank at a time. Their relationship in these final years was a quiet choreography of presence and shared history. They did not share a house. For the deep scars of the past required the breathing room of separate hearths and individual silences, but they shared the rhythm of their days with a steady consistency. Every Tuesday, Isaac would bring a bundle of seasoned firewood to Ilara's door, leaving it stacked neatly without a word, a silent testament to his enduring care. Every Friday, Ilara would leave a jar of elderberry wine or a potent poultice for his aching joints on his workbench, her way of acknowledging the toll his labor took on his aging frame. They were like two trees grown close together in a clearing, their branches occasionally touching in the wind, their roots inextricably tangled beneath the mountain soil. It was a love that didn't need the frantic, fragile declarations of youth. It was a steady, A low burning flame that provided essential warmth against the encroaching cold of mortality. On a particularly clear autumn afternoon, when the air was so crisp it felt like drinking from a cold mountain spring, they walked together toward the Cades Cove cemetery. The iron gates, once a barrier of dread that seemed to keep the spirits of the wronged trapped within, now swung open with a welcoming, familiar creak. They walked past the rows of headstones, many of them belonging to people they had known, loved, and even feared in their younger days. They stopped before Samuel's grave, which was now overgrown with wild ivy and thick green lichen that almost obscured the name carved in stone. There was no bitterness left in the air between them, only a heavy, reflective sense of what might have been if greed had not taken root. Isaac reached down to pull a stray weed from the base of the stone, his movements slow and deliberate, a final gesture of service to the cousin who had been his greatest partner and his greatest undoing. Elias stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on the gnarled head of her walking stick, watching the way the late afternoon light caught the dust motes in the air. She remembered the day she had revealed the truth to Samuel, the day his own paranoia had finally claimed his life. She realized now that the poison she had used was simply a mirror she had held up to his soul, allowing him to see the rot he had cultivated within himself. It was a heavy burden to carry, the knowledge that she had played a part in his descent, even if it was his own hand that had ultimately closed the lid on his fate. She whispered a quiet prayer for his restless spirit, asking the mountains to hold his secrets and give him the peace he could never find in his pursuit of power. The cemetery, once a place of haunting Bethlehem, felt strangely light and peaceful, as if the ghosts of their youth had finally grown tired of their grievances and retreated into the soft mountain mist. They sat on a low stone wall overlooking the valley as the sun began its slow, majestic descent behind the ridges. From this vantage point, they could see the entire history of their lives laid out in the geography of the cove. There was the site of the old cabin Isaac had built for a bride he nearly lost to his own ambition. There were the deep woods where Elias had wandered in her darkest hours of isolation. Yet there was the church where their names had been spoken in both blessing and curse by a community that didn't yet understand them. The shadows grew long, stretching across the grass like fingers reaching for the past, but they did not flinch from the darkness. They spoke of small, present things, the upcoming harvest, the health of the neighbors' livestock, and the way the light hit the ridges of the Great Smokies during the change of seasons. The silence between their words was no longer an empty void, but a comfortable bridge built on decades of mutual understanding. As the years continued to roll by, the story of Elias and Isaac began to drift into the realm of folklore and local legend. The younger generations, who had never seen the fire of fury in Elias's eyes or the crushing weight of shame on Isaac's face, began to weave their history into the fabric of the land itself. They spoke of the healer of the hollow and the carpenter of penance as if they were figures from an ancient instructional myth. The haunted cemetery remained a name on the maps, but the tales told around the winter fires changed in tone and purpose. It was no longer just a story of a woman's curse or a man's greed. It was a parable of the long, difficult road back from betrayal. The haunting was not by malevolent spirits, the elders told the children, but by the echoes of choices made and the enduring power of a heart that refuses to remain permanently broken by the world. Eventually, the time came when the mallet in the workshop fell silent for the last time, and the garden on the hill began to go to seed, reclaimed by the mountain wildflowers. Isaac passed away on a quiet winter night, his heart finally finding the total rest it had sought for so long. Elias followed him not long after, passing into the mist as the first blossoms of spring began to peek through the receding snow. They were buried side by side in the Cades Cove cemetery, beneath the protective shade of a massive white oak that seemed to stand guard over their union. Their headstones were simple, bearing only their names and the dates of their long, intertwined journey. On the day of their joint memorial, the entire valley gathered in the cemetery, not in mourning, but in a collective breath of gratitude for the lessons they had left behind. They were the last of a generation that had known the cove before the world grew small, and their passing marked the end of an era of shadows. Today, at the mists still pool in the low places of Cades Cove, and the wind still whispers through the long grass of the cemetery with a sound like a distant, comforting song. Visitors from faraway places often walk through the gates, drawn by the lingering legends of the haunted ground and the woman who once commanded the mountain fogs. They look at the weathered stones of Elara and Isaac and wonder about the truth behind the tales of betrayal and magic. But the mountains keep their secrets well, letting only the peaceful parts of the story remain in the air. The space around those two graves always seems a few degrees warmer than the rest of the hollow, and the birds seem to sing with a particular clarity in that corner of the yard. The betrayal, the greed, and the vengeance have all been swallowed by the earth long ago, all transformed into the rich, dark soil of memory. In the end, Cades Cove taught them that while a promise can be broken, the human soul has an infinite capacity to mend, and even the deepest shadows must eventually flee before the rising of a quiet, persistent sun. The story was finished, but the mountains, as always, remained as silent witnesses to the triumph of